Some souls meet not by accident, but because healing wears four paws and speaks no words. Welcome back to Vale Marks, where stories aren't just told, they're felt. Today's story is not about tragedy or triumph alone. It's about something deeper, the quiet redemption between a broken girl and a forgotten dog. A tale where a green leash is not a tool, but a thread of love, stitched by trust and pulled gently by hope. This video holds more than a touching ending. It carries a life lesson we all need. So stay with us until the very last word, because sometimes the end is where everything truly begins. In the back corner of the county animal shelter, far from the cheerful barks and wagging tails of other dogs, lay a shadow barely moving. If you passed by too quickly, you might miss him altogether, a curled-up bundle of ash-gray fur pressed tightly against the cold cement wall as if trying to disappear into it. He didn't bark. He didn't whine. He barely breathed above a whisper. But his eyes, those dark, glassy eyes, followed every movement beyond the iron bars of his kennel. They didn't beg for attention or plead for help. They only watched, as if he were waiting for something he no longer believed would come. His name wasn't listed on the clipboard attached to the gate. They simply called him Cage 17. He had no collar, no record of vaccinations, no history on file other than what the shelter manager had managed to piece together from the day animal control brought him in. But there was one thing that clung to him, quite literally, like a ghost from another life. A frayed, dirt-streaked leash, once beige, now a lifeless gray, that hung limply from his neck. It wasn't even made of proper nylon or leather, just a piece of rough canvas, worn thin from years of friction and rain. The fabric had grown stiff in some places and soft in others, patches darkened by oil, sweat, or blood no one dared ask about. It was a leash that should have been cut off the moment he arrived. But every time someone reached for it, he'd flinch, then growl low, guttural, and full of a warning that came not from anger, but from raw, buried terror. "Leave it," the manager, Glenn, told the new volunteers when they first started asking about him. "That leash is part of him now, like a scar you can't remove." The whispers around the shelter painted different versions of his past, but the one Glenn always returned to was the one he believed to be true. Cage 17, some said his name had once been Tank, was a fighting dog. Not by choice, never by choice. "Backyard rings," Glenn muttered once, his voice tight with something between rage and sorrow. Probably forced into it since he was a pup, starved, kicked, tied with that same damn leash until he learned the only way out of pain was to bite harder. But then came the fire. A neighbor reported smoke pouring out from a condemned building on the edge of town, and firefighters found him there, alone, half-starved, shaking behind a pile of rubble. No other dogs, no humans, just him and that leash. Even in the chaos, he hadn't barked, he hadn't lunged. He had simply looked at them and waited, too tired to resist, too used to being hurt to hope for anything else. Since then, months had passed, but Cage 17 had barely moved from that back corner. He ignored food until he was sure no one was watching. He growled if someone tried to open the gate, and if anyone so much as touched the leash still wrapped around his neck, his entire body would stiffen like a trap ready to snap, not in fury, but in fear. "He doesn't want to run," said Leah, one of the longtime staff members, as she refilled his water bowl from behind the gate. "He's not scared of people. He's scared of what comes with them, of being dragged, forced, hurt again." It was a strange thing, really. In a shelter full of high-energy dogs barking and bouncing for attention, the quiet ones like Cage 17 were often overlooked. People wanted dogs who ran to the gate, tails wagging, eyes pleading for love. They didn't want a dog who wouldn't even lift his head, who refused to be walked, who shrunk from every hand, even the gentle ones. So he stayed, and the leash stayed. No one knew why the shelter hadn't removed it. Maybe it was out of caution, maybe out of superstition, Or maybe, just maybe, no one wanted to strip away the one piece of his past that still defined him. That leash was a story in itself, a tether not to a human, but to everything he'd endured and barely survived. Sometimes, late in the evening, Glenn would sit nearby and just watch him from the hallway, not talking, not moving, just sitting there, while the shelter quieted and the world outside fell still. "He's not broken," Glenn once whispered, more to himself than anyone else. "He's just waiting for the right reason to get back up." But that reason hadn't come yet. Not from the volunteers, not from the trainers who offered to help, not from the well-meaning families who glanced at his kennel and quickly looked away. Cage 17 was a forgotten soul in a sea of second chances, and until someone could look past the leash, not just the one around his neck, but the invisible one chained around his heart, he would remain exactly where he was, curled in a corner, wrapped in silence, waiting for a hand that didn't pull, but offered to walk beside him. 16-year-old Emma Bennett didn't look like someone who'd change a life. She was quiet, a little awkward, with sketch pencils always sticking out of her backpack and shoelaces never quite tied right. After school, while other girls her age gathered at the mall or scrolled through endless loops of social media, Emma walked 2 blocks past her house and took a left turn most kids didn't. That turn led her to Willow Creek Animal Shelter, a place where no one asked too many questions and the only expectation was to show up and care. Emma lived with her grandmother, a soft-spoken woman who wore her grief like a shawl after the accident that took Emma's mother nearly a year ago. It had happened in the blink of an eye. A car that ran a red light, a phone call in the middle of the night, and suddenly, everything Emma knew about safety shattered into silence. Therapy hadn't helped much, nor had the forced family gatherings or the whispered condolences from school counselors. But dogs? Dogs didn't ask her to explain herself. Dogs just listened. Emma's volunteer hours started out simply, cleaning water bowls, folding towels, gently brushing the coats of the older dogs no one wanted. But over time, she started bringing her sketch pad. At first, she drew the friendliest pups, the ones with mismatched ears or floppy tongues. Then she moved on to the shy ones, the ones who paced in their kennels or pressed themselves against the walls. She wasn't trying to rescue anyone. She just wanted to see them. Then came the day she saw him. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The sun was already beginning to stretch the shadows long across the shelter's tiled floor. Emma had finished restocking the food bins and was heading toward the back hallway when a quiet stillness drew her gaze to the last kennel on the left. There, in the same cage everyone else had hurried past, lay a pit bull curled so tightly into the corner he barely resembled a dog, just muscle and bone beneath a coat of dull gray, breathing so quietly he could have been mistaken for a shadow. But his eyes met hers. Emma stopped walking. She didn't look away. Most people did. Something about the breed, the tension in his coiled posture, the growl barely hiding beneath the silence. But Emma had known what it meant to be looked at like a question mark. She had felt the sting of people deciding what kind of girl she was before she even opened her mouth. So she stood there, backpack still slung over one shoulder, and stared back. Not challengingly, not fearfully, just curiously. After a minute, she slid down to the floor, crossing her legs, her back leaning against the opposite wall. She didn't say anything. She didn't reach her hand toward the bars or try to coax him out. She just sat. After 10 minutes, she pulled out her sketch pad. No animals this time. Just lines, looping shapes, clouds that didn't make sense. Every few strokes, she looked up. He hadn't moved, but he was watching her watching him. That became a routine. Each day after school, Emma would come to the shelter, drop her backpack on the usual spot in the hallway, and settle in front of Cage 17. She never tried to name him, never pushed to touch him. She spoke softly, sometimes reading lines from the book she was carrying, other times just narrating her day like a voice message no one else would ever hear. "I got a B on that math quiz," she murmured one Thursday. "Honestly, it should have been a C, but I think Mr. Halbrook felt sorry for me." The pit bull didn't respond, of course, but his head began lifting sooner each time she came. He started blinking more slowly, occasionally shifting one paw toward the front of the kennel. A week later, he stood, just for a second, then slumped back down as if the act had taken too much trust. Emma noticed, but didn't celebrate. She knew better than to expect miracles from pain that deep. Instead, she smiled quietly and said, "That was brave." Sometimes, volunteers walked by and raised an eyebrow. "Why bother?" one of them whispered once. "He's a lost cause. Can't even be walked on a leash." Emma didn't answer. She knew they didn't see what she saw. The tension in his shoulders softening a little each day. The way he now waited by the front of the kennel even before she arrived, ears perked for the sound of her steps. It wasn't dramatic, no grand transformation, just quiet trust, built one breath at a time. And while Emma never admitted it aloud, she needed him just as much as he might have needed her. At home, the silence was heavy. At school, her smile often felt like it belonged to someone else. But here, in this back hallway with a dog who refused to be touched, she felt whole again. It was in the way he watched her as if she mattered. It was in the way his growls grew quieter, then faded entirely. It was in the way he no longer flinched when her shadow fell across his door. By the end of that second week, something had shifted. Emma sat down as always, opened her book, and began reading a poem aloud, one her mom used to love. Her voice trembled on the last line, and when she looked up, the pit bull had moved. He was at the gate now, head tilted, ears forward, eyes no longer wide with fear, but soft with something else, recognition, maybe even hope. Emma blinked back the sting in her eyes and whispered, "Hi there." For the first time, he didn't look away. It had been almost 3 weeks since Emma first sat outside cage 17, since the day her stillness and soft voice became a part of his routine. She never tried to touch him, never pushed. She simply showed up, every single day. And Milo, yes, by now Emma had started calling him that in her head, though not aloud, was changing. He no longer recoiled when she sat across from him. He began to wait by the gate. Sometimes his ears would perk up at the sound of her laugh echoing through the hallway. Other times he would just lie down and listen, his body no longer taut with dread. But the leash remained. That old, grimy piece of canvas still hung from his neck like a chain to the past. It was the one thing no one dared touch, the one thing that kept him tethered to everything he feared. Emma hated it, not just for what it was, but for what it represented. She hated how it cut against his soft fur, hated the way it had molded his posture into one of defense, as if he were always bracing for the next yank. She knew she couldn't ask the staff to remove it. Glenn had warned her. "We tried. He loses it every time we come near it. It's not worth the trauma." So, Emma didn't ask again. Instead, she decided to offer something different. It took her 3 evenings, a YouTube tutorial, and a whole skein of soft green yarn. But by Friday morning, she had it. A handmade leash, knitted carefully with small loops, soft to the touch, with a braided handle and a metal clasp she borrowed from one of the donated collars in the volunteer drawer. Green, the color of life, of spring after winter, of things growing again where everything once seemed dead. Emma held it in her hands for a long time before packing it into her backpack. She didn't tell her grandmother. She didn't tell the other volunteers. She just walked to the shelter with the quiet anticipation of someone bringing a fragile gift to someone who might not be ready to receive it. Milo was already at the gate when she arrived. His eyes flicked toward her bag, then back up to her face. Emma smiled gently. "I brought you something," she whispered, kneeling down outside the gate. She unzipped her bag slowly, as if unwrapping a secret, and pulled out the green leash. No fanfare, no dramatics, just a quiet offering, held between her fingers like an olive branch. "I know the old one hurts you," she said, her voice low. "So I made this. No one's ever used it to pull. No one's ever used it to hurt. You can say no. But maybe you could try?" Milo didn't move. He just stared. Emma waited. 1 minute, 2. She didn't rush. Then, with the gentlest movement, she reached her hand through the bars, leash draped softly over her wrist. Her other hand moved, barely brushing the frayed canvas around his neck. He didn't growl, didn't flinch. He closed his eyes. Emma's heart pounded in her chest, but her hands were steady. With a careful twist and click, she undid the old leash and let it slide to the floor. It hit the concrete with a faint thump, like the sound of something broken finally being let go. Then she slipped the green leash into place. It hung differently, lighter, softer. It didn't tug, it didn't dig. It simply rested there, like a quiet promise. Glenn had just walked by when it happened. He stopped mid-step, mouth slightly open. "Is he letting you?" he began. Emma raised a finger gently, not to silence him, but to keep the moment whole. She opened the gate, and Milo stepped forward, one paw, then another. No growl, no trembling. Just a slow, uncertain walk, like someone learning to trust gravity again. It wasn't fast, it wasn't smooth, but it was real. Emma walked backward, holding the green leash loosely in her hand, giving him space. He followed, head low, eyes on her, like a tether made not of fear but of choice. Around them, volunteers stopped what they were doing. Some looked on in disbelief. One of the staff quietly reached for her phone to capture the moment, but Glenn shook his head. "Don't," he said. "Let them have this." Milo and Emma made it halfway down the hallway before she crouched and reached out her hand. He didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned in, just slightly, just enough for his nose to brush the edge of her palm. Emma exhaled, the breath catching in her throat like a sob held back too long. She didn't cry, though. She didn't want to. She just smiled. "You're doing so good," she said. "See? Nothing to be afraid of." That day, they walked a full lap around the back courtyard. Emma never pulled the leash. She didn't have to. Milo followed because he wanted to, because the leash no longer felt like a prison, but a thread tying him to something gentle, something warm. That green yarn leash became his lifeline, and though it would fray in time, pick up dirt and rain, maybe even need replacing one day, Emma knew what it meant. It was more than just a tool. It was a beginning. And for the first time, as they stood under the soft spring sunlight, Milo looked not at the ground, not at his past, but at the girl beside him, and he wagged his tail. After that first walk, everything changed. Not all at once. Not with a sudden leap or a triumphant moment worthy of dramatic music, but quietly, slowly, like spring creeping back into the corners of winter. Emma started coming to the shelter earlier than usual. She began setting her alarm an hour before school, just so she could spend a little extra time with him. Her quiet, gray pit bull with the cautious eyes and the soft green leash that never pulled. Every morning, the staff would unlock the back gate for her with a smile and a knowing nod. By then, it had become part of the routine. The girl with the backpack and the dog who once wouldn't budge now took silent laps together under the pale morning sun. At first, Milo's steps were unsure. His ears stayed low. His tail, once a powerful whip of defense, was now tucked tightly under him. Every bird that fluttered overhead, every gust of wind that shook the trees, sent a visible shiver through his body. But Emma never rushed him. She let him move at his pace. Sometimes it took them 20 minutes to circle the outer fence line just once. Sometimes Milo would pause and sit for no reason at all, simply watching the gate. as if expecting something bad to suddenly come through it. Emma didn't tug. She just stood with him, offering quiet words and an occasional smile. "You're okay," she'd say gently. "I've got you." Bit by bit, Milo began to change. First, it was the way he stepped a little farther each time, his nose occasionally twitching at the scent of damp grass or distant squirrels. Then it was the subtle way his tail began to move, just slightly, just once, then twice. Until one morning, he wagged it freely as soon as he saw her. He began to wait by the kennel door, green leash in his mouth like a child holding their favorite blanket. His whole posture shifted. He stood taller, ears more alert, as if he were rediscovering something long buried. Trust. Emma didn't change her routine. She still sat with him afterward, often pulling out her sketchbook to draw the way sunlight hit his fur or the shadows under his eyes that were slowly beginning to fade. Sometimes she'd read him poetry. Other times, she just leaned against the fence while he rested his head on her feet. They didn't need words. They had mornings. And in those quiet hours before the world fully woke, it felt like they were the only two souls alive. One girl with a heart still heavy from grief, and one dog with scars no one could see but her. There was one particular morning that stayed with Emma more than any other. Rain had come in the night, not a storm, just a soft drizzle that clung to the air like a whisper. The yard was wet, and most of the shelter dogs stayed curled in their kennels, but not Milo. He stood ready, tail gently wagging, green leash looped over his shoulder like a badge of courage. Emma smiled at him. "You sure?" she asked, looking up at the misty sky. He pawed at the gate, waiting. So, they went out. The ground was slippery, puddles forming under the trees. Milo's steps were more cautious than usual, but he didn't stop. He followed Emma closely, his body warm beside her leg, as they moved through the fog together. At one point, a breeze kicked up, and Emma instinctively pulled her hood over her head, but Milo stopped. Emma looked down, confused. Milo tilted his head, then did something she didn't expect. He stepped in front of her and pressed his broad frame into her legs, just enough to block the wind from hitting her directly. His ears twitched as water trickled from his nose, but he stood firm, watching her closely. Emma's breath caught. "You're protecting me now?" she whispered, crouching slightly to meet his eyes. He didn't move, just blinked slowly, his entire being calm, grounded. In that moment, something shifted, not just in Milo, but in Emma, too. She had come to the shelter thinking she would help a dog in need. She had never imagined that same dog would become her anchor, her friend, the reason she smiled again. Back home, life was still quiet. Her grandmother still moved through the house like a shadow. School was still filled with hushed glances and awkward silences. But here, walking beside Milo, Emma felt seen, needed, loved in a way that didn't require explanation. They didn't have a perfect history, but they were building something better, a future that didn't start with pain. After that rainy morning, Emma began carrying an extra towel in her backpack to dry Milo's paws. Sometimes she'd sneak in a peanut butter treat or a little bandana she'd sewn from an old t-shirt. In return, Milo brought his presence, his growing joy, his quiet loyalty. The other volunteers began to notice. "Is that the same dog?" one of them asked, watching as Milo trotted beside Emma, tail high, tongue lolling slightly. "Sort of," Emma replied. "But not really." Because Milo wasn't just a rescue dog anymore. He was hers, and with every morning walk, every soft step beside her, he was proving that healing doesn't always roar. Sometimes it walks quietly. Sometimes it smells like wet grass and warm breath. And sometimes it wears a green leash made of yarn and hope. There are some friendships the world doesn't need to understand, because they were never built for anyone else to witness. That's how it was with Emma and Milo. To most people, it looked simple. A girl and her dog. A teenager who volunteered at the shelter, and a pit bull who once trembled at the sound of footsteps. But beneath that simplicity was a bond so quietly profound that even the walls of the kennel seemed to lean in closer when they were together. Emma had never told anyone at the shelter the whole story. She didn't need to. People knew her as the quiet girl, polite but withdrawn, always carrying a worn sketchbook, eyes fixed more on the floor than on the faces around her. They knew she lived with her grandmother. They didn't know that home felt like a house filled with ghosts. Since her mother's death, Emma had floated through the world like a paper boat on still water. Her grief didn't scream, it just lingered. She didn't cry at school or lash out in class. She just stopped engaging, stopped raising her hand, stopped going to sleep before 3 a.m. because her dreams were louder than her thoughts. There was a time she truly believed she didn't matter, that if she vanished, the world wouldn't notice, maybe not even mind. Then she met Milo, and everything changed. The transformation hadn't happened with a bark or a tail wag. It came with silence. With the way he looked at her and didn't ask her to smile, with the way he sat beside her, allowing her presence without question or requirement. He didn't flinch when she was quiet. He didn't back away from her sadness. Emma had read once that dogs could sense emotional pain in humans, that they could smell it, even if you didn't say a word. With Milo, she didn't have to pretend. She didn't have to explain why she sometimes stared at the same page for 10 minutes, or why her laugh caught in her throat when she tried to use it. With Milo, she could just be. She started calling him by name 2 weeks after that rainy morning walk. "Milo," she whispered one afternoon, crouching in front of his kennel with a new poem in her lap. "It means soldier, but also apple. I think it fits you. Gentle, sweet, not what people expect." He blinked at her, ears twitching at the sound of the name, and in that tiny reaction, Emma felt a click, like the moment a puzzle piece finally slides into place. Milo, a dog once trained for violence. Now he followed the voice of a girl with trembling hands. Emma began to talk more, not to other people but to him, about school, about her mother, about how it felt to be invisible and how strange it was to feel seen again. Some days after their morning walk, she'd lie down on the warm patch of grass behind the shelter, and Milo would curl beside her, his massive head resting on her stomach, her fingers slowly brushing the fur between his ears. She'd read aloud, sometimes poems, sometimes pages from her journal, and sometimes she said nothing at all. Those were the moments that meant the most, because with Milo, she didn't need to speak to be understood. One afternoon, as the golden light of sunset painted the yard in warm tones, Emma whispered, "They say pit bulls are dangerous, that you're born bad, but you're the gentlest soul I know." Milo turned his head, his amber eyes meeting hers. "You're not what they think," she said. "And maybe I'm not either." Because for so long, Emma had seen herself through the lens of loss, as the girl left behind. The girl too quiet, too broken, too odd to be picked first for anything. But Milo didn't pick her for what she pretended to be. He picked her for being there, for being consistent, for never looking away. Some days she'd sketch him while he slept. Other times she'd sing softly, songs her mom used to hum while folding laundry. Milo never moved, never judged, never barked, just listened, always listening. One day, when a group of elementary school kids came for a shelter field trip, one of them pointed at Milo and whispered, "Is he scary?" Emma knelt down beside the boy and smiled. "He used to be scared," she said, "not scary." It was the first time she'd spoken to a stranger about him, the first time she realized the difference wasn't just in Milo, it was in her, too. Milo had given her something she hadn't known she still needed. Proof that broken things can heal, that loyalty could exist without expectations, that love didn't have to be loud to be life-changing. Back home, even her grandmother began to notice. Emma's steps grew lighter. Her room, once silent, now had soft music playing. The sketches on her wall changed from grayscale clouds to sketches of trees and sunlight, and one dog sitting proudly with a green leash around his neck. One night, as they lay on the grass, stars barely beginning to emerge overhead, Emma looked down at the sleeping pit bull beside her and whispered, "You're not fierce like they say, and I'm not weak like I thought." She smiled, running her hand along his back. "We're just figuring it out. Together." Milo didn't respond, but his tail thumped once against the earth. And that was more than enough. Emma's 17th birthday was coming up, though to her it didn't feel like much. She hadn't had a party in years, not since before the accident. These days, birthdays passed quietly in the Bennett household. A small dinner, a candle and a cupcake, a warm hug from her grandmother. It was enough. Emma didn't need noise or streamers. But this year, she wanted something more, not for herself. For him. When her grandmother asked what gift she'd like, Emma didn't hesitate. "I want Milo," she said, her voice steady. Her grandmother blinked. "Honey, you already spend every day with him at the shelter." Emma shook her head gently. I want him home, with me. For real." There was a pause, just a moment. And then her grandmother smiled the way only grandmothers can when they recognize the fire behind a grandchild's quiet words. "Then let's find a way." And Emma did. She made a list. How much the adoption fee would be, what Milo would need at home, and what she could do to earn the money. The shelter didn't charge much for long-term residents, but to Emma, every dollar was a step closer to bringing her best friend home. She started washing dishes at a nearby diner after school. Quiet work, steady hands. The owner knew her grandmother and let her take the evening shifts. The smell of soap and fried onions clung to her clothes, but she didn't mind. She used her tips to buy art supplies, just enough to create a handful of small illustrations, which she began selling online through a community page. Her sketches were simple. A girl in a hoodie walking beside a broad-shouldered dog with soft eyes and a green leash. People responded to them, not because they were perfect, but because they felt real. Week by week, Emma's envelope of savings grew thicker. At night, she'd count the bills, whispering softly, "Almost there, Milo. Just a little longer." Meanwhile, at the shelter, Milo began to sense something. He'd become more alert when Emma arrived, more excited when she spoke. He followed her with a new spring in his step. He didn't know why, but he knew something was changing, and he trusted her enough not to be afraid of it. On the morning of her birthday, Emma woke early. There were no balloons, no stack of presents, just sunlight streaming through the window and a feeling she hadn't felt in years. Hope. She wore her favorite sweatshirt, the one her mom had given her the year before she passed. She packed a small box with a vanilla cupcake, a candle, and a folded piece of cardstock she'd drawn herself. On it, she had written 3 words in thick, bold strokes. "We're a family." When she arrived at the shelter, Glenn was already waiting by the front desk, holding a file with Milo's name on it and a grin that barely hid the emotion in his eyes. "You really did it," he said, handing over the papers. Emma nodded, her voice tight with excitement. "I really did." Glenn led her to the back room, where Milo was pacing near the gate, ears perked, tail wagging with an energy that was no longer hesitant, but joyful. When Emma appeared, he gave a single bark, not loud, not panicked, but almost celebratory. She knelt down and opened the gate slowly. "Milo," she whispered, holding up the sign. "Happy birthday to us." Milo rushed toward her, not with reckless force, but with a gentle urgency, burying his face against her chest, his tail sweeping the floor like a metronome of happiness. The green leash, still looped over his shoulders, looked brighter than ever in the morning light. Staff members gathered nearby, many of them holding tissues or phones, some blinking back tears they didn't expect. Even the most skeptical volunteer, the one who once called Milo a lost cause, stood in the corner, smiling silently. Glenn cleared his throat. We figured, well, this moment deserved something more. Emma turned as he motioned toward the courtyard. There, a few tables had been set up. A simple banner that read, "Forever Starts Today," waved gently in the breeze. There were bowls of treats for the dogs and a few cupcakes for the humans. It wasn't much, but it was perfect. Emma stood beside Milo, her hand resting on his back as she lit the candle on her tiny cupcake. She didn't make a wish. She didn't need to. It had already come true. That afternoon, she led Milo through the shelter gates, not as a volunteer, not on borrowed time, but as his person, his family, his forever. As they stepped into the sunshine together, Milo didn't look back. Neither did she. Later that night, at home, Emma lay on her bedroom floor with Milo curled beside her, his head resting on the same pillow she used to cry into when the world felt too big. She reached over and ran her fingers through his fur. "You're home," she whispered. "We both are." He gave a soft sigh, a dog's version of peace, and nuzzled closer. The green leash hung by the door, not needed, not forgotten, just waiting for tomorrow's walk. And in the quiet that followed, Emma finally understood what it meant to love someone enough to come back to yourself. The park was quiet that morning, the kind of peaceful hush that only early spring could bring. The air held a faint chill, not enough to bite, just enough to remind you that winter hadn't completely said goodbye. But the cherry blossoms were blooming, and the grass had taken on that rich, almost unbelievable shade of green that only exists in the weeks after the frost has melted. Emma walked along the winding path beside the pond, her boots leaving soft prints on the dew-covered earth. Her hoodie sleeves were slightly damp from brushing against the bushes, and her backpack bounced gently with each step. But none of that mattered. Not when Milo was bounding ahead, leash in tow, tail wagging like a flag in the wind. It had been almost 2 months since she brought him home. And in that time, their world had changed in the kind of way you don't always notice right away, until suddenly, you do. Milo was stronger now, not just in body, but in spirit. His fur had taken on a healthy shine, and the tension that used to live in his shoulders had disappeared. He carried himself with a kind of gentle pride, alert and calm, with his head held high as if he finally believed he belonged in this world. The green leash, Emma's handmade gift, was still their favorite. It no longer looked brand new. It had small frays along the edges and a bit of faded color from the rain and sun. But it was theirs, still soft, still light, still symbolic of everything they'd rebuilt. People noticed them now. They saw the tall, quiet girl with the soft brown eyes walking beside the once terrified pit bull, and they smiled. Some even asked questions. "What kind of dog is he?" "He's a rescue," Emma would say. "Best decision I ever made." They didn't need to know the whole story. They didn't need to know about the old leash or the bruises left behind by someone who'd used Milo for the wrong reasons. They didn't need to know about the late nights Emma had spent crying alone, or how for a long time she believed she'd never feel connected to anything again. All they needed to know was what they could see now, that Milo and Emma walked together like they were stitched from the same fabric, that their pace was perfectly matched, that their hearts, once full of wounds, now beat quietly in sync. As they rounded the hilltop of the park, Emma unclipped the leash from Milo's collar but didn't pocket it. She simply let it dangle from her wrist as he ran ahead, turning to look at her every few feet like he was making sure she was still close. She always was. The sun had just begun to rise fully, casting a warm, golden glow across the grass. Birds chirped from branches overhead, and the sound of joggers and morning cyclists drifted in from a distance. But in the space between Emma and Milo, there was a stillness that felt like sanctuary. They weren't just a girl and her dog anymore. They were something else. Partners, survivors, family. Emma took a seat on their usual bench near the willow tree, Milo's favorite spot. He patted over a moment later and rested his head in her lap, eyes half closed, tail sweeping across the wooden slats. She reached down, stroking the place behind his ears where his fur curled just slightly. "You know," she murmured, "I used to think the world was made of things that break." Milo didn't move. He just listened. He always listened. "I thought love left, that people left, that if you lost enough, you stopped being worth holding on to." She paused, running her fingers along the frayed leash. "But you didn't leave." Milo gave a soft sigh and nestled closer. "I don't know who saved who," she whispered, "and I don't really care." They sat like that for a long time, the wind brushing past like a gentle hand. Emma let her mind wander, not to the past, not to the pain, but to the future. A summer full of walks, new trails, soft blankets, maybe even a trip to the beach if Milo could handle the car ride. She thought of birthdays with dog-shaped cakes and the possibility of getting him a sibling one day. She thought about how her sketchbook had filled with color again, how she caught herself humming sometimes while cooking, how her grandmother had started smiling more, all because of a dog no one thought would heal, all because of a girl who stayed. Eventually, Emma stood up and gave Milo a gentle nudge. "Come on, boy. One more lap?" He barked once in response, joyful and confident, and took off down the path. She jogged after him, the green leash trailing between them like a ribbon connecting two hearts. They didn't need it to control or restrain. They just needed it to stay connected. As they ran together beneath the blooming trees, Emma felt something deep and quiet settle into her chest. It wasn't just happiness. It was peace. Wholeness. The kind that comes when two broken things find each other and realize they were never really broken, just waiting for the right hand to reach out. And when they reached the top of the hill again, breathless and laughing, Emma looked down at Milo and smiled. "It wasn't just a new leash," she said softly. "It was a new chance, a new trust, and a new heartbeat, woven together." Milo looked up, tail wagging, as if he agreed. Because somehow, without knowing it, they had rewritten the story that the world had written for them. One step, one stitch, one soft green loop at a time, and it was only the beginning. And so, on a quiet spring morning, two souls once abandoned by the world ran side by side. Not out of fear, not chasing anything, but simply because they had finally found their place. Emma and Milo weren't saved in a single moment. They were rewritten through patience, choice, and the simple act of not giving up on each other. That green leash? It never restrained. It simply reminded them of how far they'd come, together. As author Dean Koontz once said, "Once you have had a wonderful dog, a life without one is a life diminished." And perhaps in stories like this we realize that animals don't just walk beside us, they lift us. If this story touched something in your heart, please leave a comment below. Even just a few words. Let us know you were here. Let us know Milo mattered. And if you believe in the power of stories that heal, that connect, that truly mean something, then subscribe to Vale Marks. We're on a mission to reach 1,000 subscribers, not for numbers, but for hope. Your support fuels these stories and helps us bring even more heartfelt moments to life. Thank you for watching. This wasn't just a story. It was a gentle reminder that love always finds its way back, even in the shape of a leash.